Good evening. My name is Dr. Waddell Brooks Sr., your host, and this is Community Forum. This evening we're talking with Mr. A.S. Pate, Director, VA Medical Center, North Chicago, Illinois. Good evening, Mr. Pate.
Mr. Brooks, good evening to you.
Mr. Pate, there's some great things happening at the VA Medical Center, and we're getting ready to hear Mr. Julian Bond, who's going to be the speaker at your Dr. Martin Luther King observance. But before you tell me about the observance, tell me about the overall mission of the VA Medical Center.
The North Chicago VA Medical Center's mission is to provide high-quality primary, extended, and chronic care to veterans from throughout northeastern Illinois.
Okay.
And we are proud of the fact that our customers tell us consistently and repeatedly we are doing that, and we are doing that in ways that make them extremely happy, make their families extremely happy, and I am ever so proud of the staff here and the many fine things that they have done, and I think you and the community should be equally as proud.
Thank you very much. Mr. Julian Bond was selected to be the speaker at the Dr. Martin Luther King observance. You want to tell us how was he selected and how were you so fortunate to get him?
Well, we were fortunate. We have, for the years that I've been here, always placed tremendous emphasis on our Martin Luther King Day program.
Okay.
And Dr. King is one of those Americans who is a historical giant, but he's one who is a giant in our times. And you can't say that about a lot of American heroes, but he is one who we all have very fond memories of. We have tried to utilize this program to create some sense of awareness on the part of people who weren't as fortunate as you and I to have been around in his time, to have some appreciation for the enormity of what he did. I have the very good fortune of working with some just outstanding staff on developing these programs, and Sarah Faust, who I must give complete credit to. Sarah Faust is a nurse on our staff who has done yeoman's work on this, found Julian Bond as a speaker. She made any number of phone calls and was able to get him to commit to coming up here. And the reason I'm so excited about Julian Bond is that I have been reading about him since the mid-'60s. And to finally be able to sit down in the same room with him and listen to him tell us what it was like at that time, and to talk about where he sees this country going, is an opportunity that would not have otherwise come about. And I think that the audience is going to be just stunned by his speaking and his oratory and the experiences that he's going to share. So I'm very excited about his upcoming speech.
We're very excited that you've allowed Community Forum to come right on campus, you know, to talk about you, with you, about the exciting things that you're doing. In addition to the overall mission of the hospital here, you have several observances during the year. And you have a EO committee that's in charge of all of the observances. And I noticed that you have a Dr. Martin Luther King observance. You mentioned that Sarah Faust is the chairperson for that committee. That's in January. And you also have a Black History Month.
Black History Month, yes we do.
Celebration also.
Black History Committee, and Joe Reynolds is the chairperson of that. Joe's doing a great job. We have programs to recognize Hispanic employees, Asian Pacific, women's programs. We are a diverse medical center. We're a diverse society, and we celebrate that diversity. And we think it's important that all Americans recognize that the freedoms that we are guaranteed to all of us, and we must keep in mind that America is the only country in the world that is populated by people from every other country. I mean, we don't have an indigenous population other than Native Americans. All the rest of us are immigrants, and we are a nation of immigrants, and we need to keep that in mind and recognize that.
This is fantastic that you have this outlet, because if you didn't, there would be so many resources that would not be used, you know, if you didn't open it up to everyone, you know. What about affirmative action? I guess, is this part of the affirmative action program
Yes,
here
it
at the
is.
hospital?
My duties are twofold. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Medical Center and have the typical duties of any Chief Executive Officer, budgets and so on and so forth. But I also have the singular responsibility, the solely designated responsibility of the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer, and I am answerable directly to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. So Secretary Brown is the person who I am responsible to implement the policies of the federal government. And I take a very thorough and a very complete view that all Americans, regardless of race, sex, creed, or religion, are guaranteed freedoms and rights of the Constitution and the laws, and that the only true freedom is one that's free from fear. And unless you're free from fear of discrimination, then you're not free. And my job and the job of other responsible people is to be vigilant and make sure that that does not happen. And we take that very seriously, and we go, I think, to quite some lengths to make sure that all employees know that that is a right. That's not something that they have to ask for. It's a right they have inherently, and if those rights are abridged, then they need to tell us about it.
And this also includes the rights of women, too, because women play a major role in your administration, too. Right?
Probably the largest single group of employees gender-wise are women, probably more women than men.
Fantastic. You know, the theme of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. observance, let me see if I got this right now. Make the real dream, frame the vision for the 21st century. Tell us about that.
Pretty powerful. Pretty powerful. Well, I think that I think what Julian Bond is probably going to talk to us about is where are we going in this country in terms of race relations? Where are we going in terms of civil rights? I think that we've come from an era where there was legislated discrimination. Now we're in an era where there is economic discrimination. And how does the next generation face that challenge? Mr. Bond's generation and our generation face legal challenges. Now his generation, or next generation, has to face the social and economic ones. And I think his words are going to be very prophetic in helping us address that.
Mr. Bond was a Georgia legislator.
I understand.
It's my understanding that when he was elected, the Georgia legislature refused to seat him.
I've heard that.
Yeah,
I've heard that.
And he's I guess a professor. I guess at a couple of universities out east now.
Yes.
Great message.
Yeah.
So this will give the this younger generation here that hadn't heard of him an opportunity to come face to face with him.
I have a feeling that after hearing him speak, they will know him as well as we do, and he will be part of their lives too. They will never again say they don't know who Julian Bond is after today.
I'm wondering about your audience too. They seem to be each year real excited about these observances also.
Well, I think people are embracing the spirit of Dr. King's celebration, and certainly the speakers help focus our attention on that, and it makes me feel good. Makes me feel good to see that.
Well, thank you very much for sharing the information about the Dr. Martin Luther King observance. And I think what we'll do now is listen to his introduction, and I think you probably will introduce him.
I believe, I think
Dr. Randall Hutchinson
is going to introduce
him. So let's enjoy the speech along with our listening audience now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you so very kindly. We will expedite time now by having invocation, Chaplain David Spitz, opening remarks, and proclamation by A.S. Pate, the director of this medical center.
Let us rise. Rock of Ages, you from the lofty perspective of time view the relationship of brother with brother. Once again, we have assembled as a hospital community to celebrate the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and of his generation of social activists. May the stirring messages that we are soon to hear, especially that of our main speaker, a shaper of those times that were changing, inspire us to action. Help us to identify with the pain and suffering that is in our midst. For we live in a land of plenty, but the needs are very great. Help us to do our part to end the poverty, homelessness, and hopelessness that plague our cities. Help us to respond in a caring manner to the violence at home and on the streets, the substance abuse and the untreated illness and the injustice that sap the spiritual strength of our civilization and loosen its moral fiber. And imbue us with that special vision that allows us to see in each human being an image of the divine. May we not cave in to the enormity of this task. Teach us that together we can make a difference. Loving mentor, teacher of that special way to go, may we never succumb to the inaction of bitterness over the injustice committed by others, but rather be empowered by that which is within us that we can do. Thus, in our own special way, we will truly make real the dream. Amen. Please be seated.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to North Chicago on this beautiful winter day. And I'd like to welcome a very special guest, Mr. Julian Bond, who's a man whose place in American history is already being written, and a man who you will hear from shortly. I have a proclamation that I would like to read. It is proclaimed, whereas the late Dr. Martin Luther King was born January 15, 1929, and was assassinated on April 4, 1968. And whereas Dr. King was an American civil rights leader who worked for the civil rights of all, and whereas Dr. King received the Nobel Prize for leading the struggle for human justice and human dignity for all American citizens through nonviolent demonstrations, and whereas Dr. King rejected separatism and tried to pull together the various racial, cultural, and ethnic groups in America, and whereas Dr. King was assassinated while working to make the American dream a reality for all, and whereas the work of Dr. King continues to go on in the work and in the hearts of those who still believe in the American dream, therefore this day, January 10, 1997, is officially designated as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day at the North Chicago VA Medical Center, and patients and staff and volunteers are encouraged to attend this special program commemorating Dr. King this day in the auditorium. I would like to now ask...
Sandra is not present at this time. We will move right on with the introduction of our speaker by Chaplain Hutchison.
To Mr. Pate, to our special guests from the community and from the Naval Base, and to you all of the hospital community, it's my happy privilege to introduce our guest speaker. As you notice in your bulletin, there is a bio on Mr. Bond, and it's rather lengthy and impressive. And I simply just want to point out, in the interest of time, some interesting highlights from Mr. Bond's life. Not only do you get to know a person by observing them from afar and admiring them, but as Barbara and I was coming from the airport, we had a chance to chat with him and get to know him more personally, and found out that he was a very warm and outgoing person, a father of 5 children and 7 grandchildren. And not only that, but he shared some stories with us that not only from the civil rights movement, but from his own life that was rather amusing. And without any further ado, to give him all the time and the latitude that he needs, I present the Honorable Julian Bond. Let's hear him now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. I'm sure you've heard it said by many speakers before me what a great pleasure it is to be here. And so it is a great pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure, honestly, to be here in many different ways, not the least of which has to do with my former profession. If you read that too long biography, you'll see that I used to be a politician. And I know that's not the most popular profession to be in the United States today. So it's a great pleasure when one of us is invited anywhere by anyone. As you've heard on the trip from the airport to here, we talked about old times and old stories, particularly about the late Dr. Martin Luther King. I now teach college students civil rights history. And because I'm older than they are, they assume that I was everywhere during the civil rights movement. And that whenever we come to an occasion, to the march over the Selma Bridge, to the movement in Albany, to the Freedom Rider riots, that I was there. Well, I was at some of these places, but I wasn't at every one, and I simply don't have a story to go with every occasion. But I did know Dr. King. In fact, I had a special relationship with Dr. King that almost no one else in the United States has had. In 1961, King taught at his alma mater, my alma mater, Morehouse College in Atlanta, for 1 semester. He taught 1 course, a survey course in philosophy, and I was one of 6 students in that class. So I'm one of 6 people in the United States who honestly can say that he was a student of Martin Luther King. Now, like so much of what I learned in college, I am sorry to tell you I have almost no memory of anything that transpired in that class. If I took notes, I don't have them now. I didn't have the presence of mind to bring a tape recorder to class. So whatever passed between teacher and student is just gone. But I do remember one occasion, one day after class was over. He and I were walking across the Morehouse College campus. And I turned to him and I said, "Doc," his friends called him Doc. I said, "Doc, how you doing?" He said, "Julian, I'm not doing well." He said, "Unemployment is high. Segregation is everywhere." He said, "I feel awful." He said, "I have a nightmare." I said, no, Doc, turn that around. Say, "I have a dream." And, well, of course, the rest is history. I want to spend my few moments with you talking about the past, about where we came from and where we are and where we may be going. It was just after the turn of the 20th century that the great scholar W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. Now, we are just short years away from the century's end, but it's easy to predict that it may well be the problem of the century yet to come. Now, we meet in the aftermath of recent elections in which the electorate, even more than usual, was separated by gender and by race. We meet in the aftermath of Supreme Court decisions which attack affirmative action, in a climate in which candidates for the presidency of the United States made trashing affirmative action the centerpiece of their campaigns. We're meeting in the dark shadow of Denny's and of Texaco, of California's Proposition 209. Everywhere we look around us, we see a clear racial fault line which divides American society as much now as at any time in our past. And finally, we meet in the annual season of celebration of the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King, at a time when we look back on his days to see what lessons they have to offer us today. Now, the picture we see is not without its brighter side. If we look over several decades rather than in snapshot moments, the portrait we see shows clear progress throughout this century. No more do signs read white and colored. The voter's booth and the schoolhouse door now swing open for everyone, no longer closed to those whose skins are dark, because all of us here, God willing, will soon see what almost no American living now has ever seen: the birth of a new century and the death of an old one. We ought to take some time to determine how this earlier progress was won, and how, once secured, how fragile its promise soon became. What made that movement slow down? What forces derailed the freedom train? We stand now in reflection of that earlier movement's successes, many of us confused about what our next step should be. The task that lies ahead for all of us is enormous, equal to, if not greater than, the job already done. But today we see a different picture than in the glorified past. Today we see a population largely indifferent to the despair and poverty around them, a people more concerned about trapped whales in Alaska than babies trapped in poverty in Alabama. Let me talk about how we came to this moment, about changes over time, about now and then, about what was, about what may be, about where we are and where we should be going. And let me talk, if you will, about my own family, beginning with my grandfather, James Bond. James Bond, who was born a slave in Kentucky in 1863. Now, his slave mother had been given away as a wedding present to a new bride. And when that bride became pregnant, her husband, that's my great-grandmother's owner and master, exercised his right to take his wife's slave as his mistress. That union produced 2 children, one of them my grandfather. Now, under English law, status descended from the father. But in the states of the old slaveocracy, status derived from the mother, ensuring that the master's black children would not dare to presume to be his heirs. But things change. Today, that slave's grandson teaches at the university founded by slave owner Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, and teaches young Americans about the modern-day struggle for human liberty. Now, that struggle has its roots more in Jefferson's words than in his deeds, but its parallels in my grandfather's membership in a transcendent generation, a body of black women and men born in the 19th century in slavery, freed from slavery by the Civil War, determined to make their way as free women and men. The young people I teach are modern young men and women, filled with all the cynicism and despair of their age. For them, these are the worst of times, and my daily documentation of a harsher and more oppressive past doesn't always convince them that these days could be better than the days they study with me. Today's world holds no heroes for my students, and this lack of heroes, coupled with their pessimism, makes them unlikely candidates to conduct a movement of their own. I teach them about a more modern generation than my grandfathers. They study a more recent generation, a generation whose members were born in segregation in the 20th century, who were freed from segregation's restraints by their own efforts, who were determined to make their way in freedom. Today we are 3 decades past the second Reconstruction. the modern movement for civil rights that eliminated legal segregation in the United States. And we are 13 decades past the first Reconstruction, the single period in American history in which the national government insisted on and enforced civil rights for black Americans. 100 years ago, as my grandfather approached his 40th birthday, black Americans faced prospects eerily similar to those we face today. It was 30 years after Civil War and the first Reconstruction. The 19th century was winding down. Many Americans grew tired of worrying about the welfare of the newly freed slaves, tired of fighting to secure their right to vote, tired of fighting to win their right to attend a public school. Then, as now, scientific racism and social Darwinism were in vogue. Then, as now, racist demagogues walked the land. Then, as now, minorities and immigrants became scapegoats for real and imagined distress. Then a reign of state-sanctioned and private terror, including ritual human sacrifice, swept across the South to reinforce white supremacy. That's when the heavy hand of racial segregation descended across the South, a kind of cotton curtain that separated blacks and whites, separated blacks from education, from opportunity, but not from hope. Speaking in 1901, my grandfather saw the world about him hopefully. He said then, "The false partitions set up to separate classes and races are falling down. Illogical and unchristian distinctions, though still disgracing the age and hampering the spirit of progress, must soon yield to justice and right. Then forward in the struggle for advancement. Wrong," he said, "for a time may seem to prevail. The good already accomplished seem to be overthrown. But forward in the struggle, inspired by the achievements of the past, sustained by a faith that knows no faltering, forward in the struggle." Well, what and how I teach my students about yesterday's struggle reflects a great change in history teaching, a rethinking of by whom and for whom yesterday's civil rights movement was made. When we look back at that movement from today, we now see a very different view of the events and personalities of the time. Instead of the towering figures of Kings and Kennedy standing alone, we now see an army of anonymous women and men. Instead of famous speeches made to multitudes, we now also see the planning and the work that preceded the triumphant speech. Instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now see aggressive demands and the ethic of self-help. And instead of a sudden upsurge of black activism in Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unending history of aggressive challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago as slavery time. And instead of a movement that ended in 1968 with the death of Dr. King, we now see continued movement, stretching from the ancient past until this moment, with different forms and personalities, with different methods and techniques, a movement whose central goal has always been the elimination of strictures based on race. And we see a movement which has long followed a plan articulated when the 20th century was brand new, a plan that still fits our circumstances almost exactly today. In 1905, Dr. Du Bois laid out this plan. He said, "We must complain. Yes, plain, blunt complaint, ceaseless agitation, unfailing exposure of dishonesty and wrong. That is the ancient, unerring way to liberty, and we must follow it." Next, he said, "We propose to work. These are the things that we must try to do. We must push the matter of stopping the curtailment of our political rights. We must urge Negroes to vote honestly and effectively. We must push the matter of civil rights. We must organize business cooperation. We must build schoolhouses and increase the interest in education. We must bring Negroes and labor unions into mutual understanding. We must study Negro history. And we must attack crime among us." to do all in our power by word and by deed to increase the efficiency of our race, the enjoyment of its rights, and the performance of its duties. This is a large program, Dr. Du Bois said. It can't be realized in a short time, but now is the critical time. In 1909, Du Bois and others founded the NAACP. It soon developed an aggressive legal strategy aimed at striking down racial restrictions enshrined in law, and it triumphed in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, ending segregation in public schools. That decision ended segregation's legality, but it also gave a nonviolent army the license to challenge segregation's morality too. From Brown in 1954 forward, the movement expanded its tactics, its targets, and its techniques. The 1955 Montgomery bus boycott introduced a new leader, Martin Luther King, and he began to articulate a new method, nonviolent resistance, of fighting segregation. But as the movement was expanding and growing, most American presidents from 1954 forward approached race relations gingerly, if at all. Dwight Eisenhower was a benign racist who lobbied the Supreme Court's Chief Justice against integrating schools, and his vacillation encouraged the resistant white South. John F. Kennedy only reluctantly endorsed equal rights before his life and his term were cut short. But in Lyndon Johnson, the movement found a match. A politician who wanted to be remade from Southerner to Westerner to American, a figure conscious that history would be his judge, a human-hearted man more sensitive to appeals for racial justice than any president before him. In this period, great gains were won at lunch counters, at movie theaters, at bus stations, at polling places, and the fabric of legal segregation became undone. But before it ended, that movement was our democracy's finest hour. A voteless people voted with their bodies and their feet and paved the way for other social protests. The anti-war movement of the 1960s drew its soldiers from the Southern Freedom Army. The reborn movement for women's rights took many of its cues and much of its momentum from the Southern movement for civil rights. These three great impediments to our democracy's success, gender, race, abuse of power, all of these were weakened by the movement's drive, and we are all better for it today. But despite impressive increases in the number of black people holding public office, despite our ability now to sit and eat and ride and vote and go to school in places that used to bar black faces, in some important ways, non-white Americans face problems more difficult to attack now than in all the years that went before. Now, much of the groundwork for 1994 and 1996 election victories was laid in the 1960s and climaxed in the 1980s. Over time, opposition to government, especially Washington government, succeeded opposition to communism as a secular religion. These became the energies driving the coalition that captured Congress in 94 and 96. As long ago as 1964, they had begun to remake the Republican Party as the white people's party, and they found a winning formula at the intersection of race and opposition to activist government. Then came the 1980s, presided over by an amiable ideologue whose sole intent was removing government from every aspect of our lives. He brought to power with him a band of financial and ideological profiteers who descended on the nation's capital like a crazed swarm of right-wing locusts, bent on destroying the rules and the laws that protect our people from poisoned air and water and from greed. But nowhere was their assault on the rule of law so great as in their attempt to subvert, ignore, defy, and destroy the laws that require an America which is bias-free. Conflict of interest became a precondition for employment in government. Then, as now, they unleashed a gang of corporate sociopaths to raid and to ravage the national treasury. Then, as now, they forced a form of triage economics on us. Then it produced the first increase in infant mortality rates in 20 years and pushed thousands of poor and working poor Americans deeper and deeper into poverty. By the middle of the 1980s, the Census Bureau reported that the number of Americans living in poverty had increased over the previous 4 years by 9 million, the biggest increase since these statistics were first collected. Even today, the poorest 2/5 of our population receives a smaller share of the national income, and the richest 2/5 a larger share than at any time since 1947. In this period, income for the bottom 1/5 of America's population went down by 9%. For the top 1/5, it went up by 32%. And for that 1% at the very top, let me see the hands. For that 1% at the very top, after-tax income went up by 102%. Those years then were what these years now threaten to be, a kind of a festive party thrown for America's rich. Then the middle class got by on 2 paychecks, median family income was stagnant, the percentage of young families who owned their own homes went down for the first time since the Depression, savings and investment were down, more Americans working longer hours at lower pay, and for those Americans whose skins are black or brown, the rate of poverty went up while median family income went down. Poverty for black and Hispanic senior citizens went up, poorer children got poorer, their numbers in poverty almost doubling. By the late 1960s, 3/4 of all black men were working. By the end of the 1980s, only 57% had a job. In 1968, the Kerner Commission, appointed by President Johnson to investigate the causes and prescribe the cures of the riots of 1967, concluded that racism was the single most important cause of continued racial inequality in income, housing, employment, and life chances between blacks and whites. But then civil rights champion Lyndon Johnson was succeeded by Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon had been a civil rights advocate as Eisenhower's vice president, but first as candidate and then as president himself, he pursued a Southern strategy which used race to leech white voters away from the Democrats. Within a few very short years, the growing number of blacks, of other minorities, of women, pushing for entry into the academy, media, business, government, created a backlash in the discussion over race. The previously privileged majority exploded in angry resentment at having to share space with the formerly excluded. Opinion leaders began to reformulate and redefine the terms of the discussion. No longer was the Kerner Commission's description of the problem acceptable. Any indictment of majority America could be abandoned, and instead a Susan Smith defense was adopted. Black people did it to the country, did it to themselves. Black behavior, not racism, became the reason why whites and blacks live in separate worlds. Racism retreated, pathology advanced. The burden of racial problem solving shifted from its creators to its victims. The failure of the lesser breeds to enjoy society's fruits became their fault alone. In a kind of nonsensical tautology, we heard again and again, these people are poor because they are pathological because they are poor. So pressure for additional civil rights laws became a kind of special pleading. The privileged population suddenly became a victim class. Aggressive blacks and pushy women were blamed for America's despise. But there remains one item on the civil rights agenda, economic justice, that has been largely unaddressed and certainly remains unfulfilled. The strategies of the movement in the 1960s were litigation, organization, and mobilization, aimed at creating a national constituency for civil rights. But in the 1970s, electoral strategies began to dominate. The numbers of locally elected black officials began to multiply. the increase coincided with the decline in political party organization. The crucial task of registering and turning out voters fell to organizations like the NAACP. Other stalwarts of the 1960s, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, experienced decline or simply disappeared. And as black workers began to win access to industrial jobs and organized labor, the jobs went offshore. Labor declined in power and influence. Forgotten in the excitement of the inauguration of new black mayors was the plight of blue-collar blacks. President Nixon's plan to embrace black capitalism as a cure for undeveloped ghettos was embraced by a growing generation of politically connected black entrepreneurs, and their cause gained ascendancy. Black elites joined white elites at the feeding trough. Since the heady days of the 1960s, too many have concentrated too much on enriching too few, while the large numbers of working-class black Americans, like their counterparts in the larger society, have seen their plight ignored, their income shrink, and their jobs disappear. Now, remember, remember that Martin Luther King lost his life supporting a garbage workers' strike in Memphis. The right to decent work at decent pay remains as basic to human freedom as the right to vote. Negroes, King said in 1961, are almost entirely a working people. There are pitifully few Negro millionaires and few Negro employers. That there are many more black millionaires today is a tribute to the movement King led. That there are actually fewer black people working today is an indictment of our times and our economic system and a reflection of our failure to keep the movement coming on. Well, everywhere we look, we see conditions different from, but just as daunting as the bus back seats, the fire hoses, and the billy clubs of 30 years ago. When I was young, bad boys fought with knives, not with automatic weapons. Crack was something that if you stepped on it, you'd break your mother's back. The songs we sang were about June and moon, not ugly words for women. But on the streets and sidewalks where black America lives, crime and violence are the rule. As angry white men blow up buildings, angry black men blow each other away. And remember, these are not mostly drive-by shootings or stranger shooting stranger. In most of these deaths, the killer and the victim knew each other. These are friend shooting friend. In America today, compared with a white child, a black child is 1.5 times more likely to grow up in a family whose head did not finish high school, 2 times as likely to be born to a teenage mother, 2.5 times more likely to be born at low birth weight, 3 times more likely to live in a single-parent home, 4 times more likely to have a mother who had no prenatal care, 4.5 times more likely to live with neither parent, 5 times as likely to depend solely on his mother's earnings, and 9 times as likely to be the victim of homicide as a teenager or a young adult, the end of a long, winding, uphill struggle to beat the racial odds against success. And when that child plays by the rules, stays in school, graduates, he or she will not earn on an equal level with whites. In life chances, median income, life expectancy, by all the standards by which life is measured, black Americans see a deep gulf between the American dream and the reality of their lives. Now, over the last 30 years, the period of the Second Reconstruction, the most effective tool for advancing entry into the mainstream has been affirmative action. Now its opponents tell us that it doesn't work, or it used to work, but it doesn't work now, or we used to need it, but we don't need it now, or it only helps people who don't need it. It isn't really about preferential treatment for blacks. It's about removing preferential treatment whites have received through history, giving equal treatment to people who were denied equality in the past. Critics of affirmative action fly in the face of clear evidence that it created the sizable middle class that constitutes 1/3 of black America today. From 1970 to 1990, the number of black police officers doubled, the number of black electricians tripled, the number of black bank tellers more than quadrupled, These aren't numbers. These are the growth and the spread of the tiny middle class I knew as a boy into a stable 1/3 of all black America today. Women and men with homes and jobs, tax-paying citizens, able to provide for their families now and in the future. But the critics just won't quit. They like to argue that affirmative action stigmatizes all blacks, making the people who benefit from it feel as if they've received something they don't deserve. Why doesn't somebody make that argument about the millions of whites who got into college as a legacy because Dad was an alumni? Or those who got good jobs because Dad was president of the company? Now, you don't see them walking around, their heads held low, their eyes hidden, complaining that they've lost their self-esteem because everybody in the executive washroom is whispering about how they got their job. Even affirmative action's poster child, Justice Clarence Thomas, even he argues that affirmative action makes black people feel bad. But you know something? He may be right, because he has been in a foul and nasty mood ever since he got his last affirmative action job. At this time of year, we tend to look back on the Martin Luther King days with nostalgia, as if those were the only years we were truly able to overcome. Well, one reason we can't do it today is because of the way we look at Dr. King. For most of us, he's little more than a grainy image seen in black and white television film, pictures taken at the March on Washington more than 3 decades ago. But King, of course, was much more than that, and the movement much more than Martin Luther King. And he's not the only soldier missing from the freedom fight. He didn't march from Selma to Montgomery by himself. He didn't speak to an empty field at the March on Washington. There were thousands marching with him and before him, and thousands more who did the dirty work that preceded the triumphant march. Yesterday's movement succeeded because the victims became their own best champions. When Rosa Parks refused to stand up, when Martin King stood up to preach, mass participation came to the movement for civil rights. There's enormous opportunity for service, for action available to each of us, wherever, whomever we happen to be. For too many people today, the fight for equal justice has become a spectator sport, kind of like the National Basketball Association, in which most of the players are black and most of the spectators are white. But in this true-to-life competition between good and evil, the players are of every color and condition, the fate of all the fans tied to the points scored on the floor. When good prevails, the spectators win too. When 4 little girls died in a Birmingham church bombing 3 decades ago, Sally Ride won the right to shoot the moon. Because black young people faced arrest at Southern lunch counters 3 decades ago, the law their bodies wrote now protects older Americans from age discrimination, protects Jews and Muslims and Christians from religious discrimination, protects the disabled from exclusion because of their condition. It took but one woman's courage to start a movement in Montgomery, the bravery of 4 young men in Greensboro to set the South on fire. Surely there are men and women, young and old, here today who can do the same, because now the ancient forces of evil, in new faces, threaten America again. There is hope, but hope is beyond anybody's ability to predict the future. We can be sure, however, that if the present climate continues, Dr. Du Bois' early 20th century will come true. Race will continue to mark our society. Now, when I was born, more years ago than you have to know, there were nearly 150 workers making contributions to the Social Security system for every retiree. When I started working, there were only 5 workers for every retiree. Now, of course, I don't know who my 5 were, but I'll bet you their names were Carl, Ralph, Bob, Steve, and Bill. When I retire, there are going to be 3 workers paying in the system for every retiree. And their names are likely to be Kwanzaa, Maria, and Jose. And we need to make sure that Kwanzaa, Maria, and Jose have the best jobs, the best health care, the best education they possibly can. Now, some other words from my grandfather might well be remembered here, too. He said in 1892, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good or hopeful in the progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm. In every flash of lightning an omen of evil. In every shadow that falls across his path a lurking foe. But he forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that the lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardships and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories." Greater efforts and grander victories. That was his generation's promise 104 years ago. That was the promise made by the generation that won the Great World War for Democracy 5 decades ago. That was the promise made by those who brought democracy to America's darkest corners 3 decades ago. And that is the promise we must seek to honor today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Horace Julian Bond. And at this time, we'll bring Sandra Thomas to come in her way. Run the whole thing. Hold it for a minute.
Keeping in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King and his message, no matter what may come, we have to know that God's truth is marching on. My life has seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the
Ramos. God is good.